For a while in college, I worked at a fast food chain, and I'd commonly work the late shift. The graveyard hours from midnight to 6 a.m. were usually quiet, with just the occasional drunk or insomniac stopping by for a quick bite. But there was one night that changed how I felt about those empty, neon-lit hours forever. I remember it was a Thursday, the kind of night where the air felt thick with something unspoken. I was alone in the store. My manager had called in sick, and the other staff had either quit or were no-shows. The silence was so deep it felt like I was at the bottom of the ocean, with only the hum of the refrigerators for company. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, a sound that usually brought relief from the monotony, but this time, it sent a chill down my spine. A man walked in, his face obscured by a hood, his steps eerily silent. He didn't approach the counter. Instead, he just stood there, staring at the menu as if he could see through it. "Welcome to Burger Hut. What can I get for you?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. There was no response. He just kept staring, his body unnaturally still. I tried again, my voice cracking this time. "Sir?" Finally he moved, but it wasn't towards me. He walked to the corner of the dining area, where there was a small, forgotten table with a chair that always creaked. He sat down, his back to me, and the chair didn't make a sound. That's when the first wave of fear hit me. That chair always creaked. I watched him, my heart pounding. He didn't move and he didn't order. Instead, he just kept sitting there. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? A customer was sitting quietly? Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out completely, plunging the store into darkness except for the emergency exit signs casting a faint red glow. My hand fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. I hadn't charged it, thinking I'd be fine with the store's phone. But now, the store phone was dead too. The line cut. I could hear the person breathing a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to echo through the room. I grabbed a flashlight from under the counter, its beam cutting through the darkness. I shone it towards him, and for a split second, I saw his face. He was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that reflected the light back at me like a cat's. He stood up, and the air grew colder. "You shouldn't be here alone," his voice was a whisper, yet it filled the room. I backed away, my legs weak and my mind racing. "Who are you? What do you want?" The person didn't answer. Instead, he just walked towards the counter, his steps still silent and his presence overwhelming. Just as he reached the counter, the lights flickered back on, and he was gone. Not just gone from the room, but it was as if he had never even been there. The chair was empty, and the air was no longer cold. I didn't wait. I grabbed my jacket and ran out into the night, not stopping until I was blocks away, my breath visible in the chilly air. I never went back to that job, and I've never worked another night shift since. But sometimes, late at night, especially when I'm alone, I swear I can hear that slow, deliberate breathing, and I feel the chill of that night all over again. I used to do late-night food deliveries to make a little extra cash. It was the kind of job that could take you to the seediest parts of town, or the quietest suburbs, all under the cloak of darkness. But there was one night, and one delivery, that I'll never forget. It was a night that made me question what lurks in the shadows when the world sleeps. It was around 2 a.m. when I got the ping for delivery to an address I didn't recognize. The app showed it was on the outskirts of town, near an old industrial park that had long been abandoned. This was the kind of place where the streetlights flicker, and the silence is so thick you can hear your own heartbeat. I picked up the order from a 24-hour diner, a simple burger and fries, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I drove, the city lights faded, and the road became narrower and twisted into darkness. My GPS was leading me down a path barely wide enough for my car, with overgrown bushes scraping against the sides. The place turned out to be an old warehouse, its windows boarded up and graffiti covering every inch of its exterior. I parked, my headlights cutting through the fog, and stepped out. The air was cold, unusually so, and carried a damp, musty smell. I grabbed the food and approached the entrance, my steps echoing in the silence. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the warehouse was vast, filled with shadows and the faint hum of machinery long since dead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the emptiness. Somewhere in the darkness, another voice responded, faint and distant. "Over here." I followed the sound, my flashlight beam dancing over old machinery, discarded crates, and piles of debris. Eventually I found him, or rather, what I thought was him, sitting on an old office chair in the middle of the room. He was just a silhouette against the dim light filtering through a crack in the ceiling. Here's your order," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The person didn't move and didn't speak. I stepped closer, placing the food on a nearby crate. That's when I noticed something was off. His hands were pale, almost translucent, and his face, it was too still, too perfect, almost like a mask. "Thanks," he finally said, his voice a whisper, almost mechanical. I nodded, eager to leave, but as I turned he spoke again. "Stay for a moment. It's been so long since I've had company." I should have run, but there was something in his voice, some kind of sadness, that made me pause. "I really should go," I stammered. "But you've just arrived," he said, and then something changed. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw figures emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct, but their eyes were like black holes, sucking in the light. They were workers, or at least what was left of them. Their clothes were from decades ago, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow. "We've been waiting," one whispered, its voice like the wind through a graveyard. Panic surged through me. I bolted for the door, but the warehouse seemed to stretch, the exit receding into the distance. Behind me, the whispers grew louder and more desperate. "Stay with us. Join us." I don't know how, but eventually I got to the door, my hands fumbling with the latch and the cold breath of the dead on my neck. I burst out into the night, the door slamming shut behind me. I didn't look back, but instead just ran to my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away and the warehouse disappearing into the night. After that night, I never went back to that part of town, and never took a delivery after dark again. But sometimes, in the quiet of my own home, I hear whispers and feel a chill, and I wonder if they're still waiting. I wonder if those spirits are still hungry for company in that endless night. I used to work the graveyard shift at a video store, which was nice because that meant I barely had to interact with customers. Most nights, it was just me, the flickering fluorescent lights, and rows upon rows of VHS tapes and DVDs, all whispering their forgotten stories. But there was one night that I'll never forget. It was around 2 a.m., or the witching hour as they call it, and I was behind the counter flipping through an old magazine. Then the bell above the door jingled and I looked up, expecting to see some late-night insomniac, or maybe a college kid looking for a horror movie. Instead, this random guy walks in, looking like he stepped out of a black and white film. He was wearing this old-fashioned type suit, and his face was pale and his eyes, I don't even know how to describe it. His eyes looked like black holes, sucking in all the light. I tried to sound casual. "Hey, what can I help you with?" The man didn't reply. Instead, he walked straight to the horror section, his steps silent on the worn carpet. I watched him, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. Eventually he pulled out a tape, one I'd never seen before. The cover was blank, just a plain black sleeve. He brought it over, placed it on the counter, and his voice, when he spoke, was like a whisper from the grave. "This one," he said, his breath cold against my face. I tried to scan the tape, but there was no barcode. This isn't in our system. Where do you find it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at me with those empty eyes. I shrugged, figuring maybe it was a return or something, and decided to let him rent it for free just to get him out of there. But then, he just handed me a wad of cash, all old bills, and left without another word. The rest of the night was quiet, too quiet. Around 3:30, I decided to check out what was so special about this tape. I popped it into the store's old VCR. The screen filled with static, then cleared to show an empty room, similar to the store, but darker and older. Then figures started appearing, walking in and out of the frame, all in old clothes, moving like they were in some kind of silent film. Suddenly, the figure from earlier appeared on screen, looking directly at the camera, and at me. He smiled, and I swear the temperature in the store dropped. That's when I heard the bell jingle again. I turned, expecting to see him, but the store was empty. The tape kept playing, showing the store, but now it was filled with those ghostly figures, and they were all looking at me through the screen. I yanked the tape out faster than anything, my hand shaking. The screen went black, but the figures, they didn't disappear. They were still there, in the reflection of the screen, watching me. I turned around, and there he was, standing at the door, his smile wider now, and more menacing. "Keep it," he said, his voice echoing like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You'll see more." I quit the very next day. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that bell jingle, and I see shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye. That tape? I burned it, but I'm pretty sure it didn't matter. Some things you just can't get rid of. I've worked at our local supermarket for several years, and I've done my fair share of night shifts. There's just something about the quiet and the hum of the refrigeration units that puts me at ease. But still, nothing could have prepared me for what happened on one particular night. I remember it was a Thursday, just past midnight, and the store was empty except for me and the night manager, Sarah. Sarah was new. I think she'd just been hired about a month ago at this point, and she was the kind of woman who turned heads. With her long dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you, she had a mysterious air about her. We had chatted a few times up to this point, but there was always something about her that felt off to me. This night started like any other. I was restocking the dairy section when I heard a soft, almost melodic humming coming from the back of the store. It was Sarah, organizing the stockroom. Her voice was actually beautiful, almost hypnotic, but there was an eerie quality to it that made the hair on my neck stand up. Around 2 a.m., the power flickered. It was brief, just a second, but enough to plunge the store into darkness before the emergency lights kicked in. When the lights came back, Sarah was standing right behind me, her face inches from mine. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice chillingly calm. "Did I scare you?" I tried to laugh it off, but really, my heart was racing. "Yeah, just a bit. The power, huh?" Then Sarah made this expression where she smiled, but her eyes didn't. "It happens sometimes, but don't worry, I'm here to keep you company." The rest of the shift was uneventful, or so I thought. I was checking the expiration dates on the eggs when I noticed something odd. The security cameras, usually blinking the red lights, were all off. I mentioned it to Sarah, who simply said, "Must be the power glitch, I'll check it out." She disappeared into the office, and I decided to take a break, sitting on a stack of crates near the back. That's when I heard it, a whisper, not from Sarah, but from somewhere else in the store. It was faint, but it sounded like someone was calling my name. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and started walking towards the sound. The whispers grew louder and more distinct, coming from the freezer section. As I approached, the cold air hit me like a wall, and there, in the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Sarah was there, but she wasn't alone. Shadows moved around her, whispering, their forms barely visible in the mist from the freezers. Her eyes, when she turned to look at me, were not human. They glowed with a pale, unnatural light. "What are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. She stepped forward, her form shifting slightly, becoming more ethereal. "I'm not just Sarah," she said, her voice now layered with other voices, other tones. "I'm what keeps this place safe, but tonight, you've seen too much." The shadows converged, and I felt a cold grip on my arm. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I bolted through the aisles, the whispers growing louder, the cold air chasing me. I reached the front door, fumbling with the locks, and burst out into the night. I never went back to that job. When I told my story, people laughed it off as a night shift hallucination, but I know what I saw. Sarah, or whatever she was not just an attractive woman. She was something else, something that guarded the night, and perhaps something that chose not to let me stay. I worked tech support in a call center for about 10 years, and it was a lot like how you might imagine. Endless calls, repetitive issues, and the occasional irate customer who made you question your life choices. But nothing prepared me for the night shift on January 12th, 2023. That night, the mundane turned into something far more chilling. It was a typical winter evening, the kind where the cold seeps into your bones and the wind howls like a pack of wolves outside. The call center was unusually quiet, which was a relief after the holiday rush. I sat at my cubicle, the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting eerie shadows across my desk. The silence was broken only by the hum of the computers and the distant clatter of a printer. Around midnight, the first strange call came in. A woman's voice, shaky and barely above a whisper, asked if I could help her with her internet connection. Her voice was so faint, I had to turn up the volume on my headset. "It's not just the internet," she said, her voice trembling. It's like something's watching me through the screen." I tried to reassure her, running through the usual diagnostics, but her connection dropped abruptly. I logged the incident, thinking it was just another case of paranoia. Then an hour later, another call came in. This time, it was a man, and his voice was thick with fear. Every time I try to log in, it shows me pictures of my house from different angles. I've never even uploaded these. When he said that, my heart skipped a beat. I asked him to send screenshots, but his call also ended suddenly. I checked the logs, both calls that originated from numbers that didn't even exist in our system. The night grew darker, and the air in the call center felt heavier. My colleagues, usually chatty, were now silent, each lost in their own tasks or perhaps their own fears. Then my phone rang again. This time, it was a child, no older than 10. The computer keeps saying I see you over and over. It won't stop. His voice sounded so small and so scared. I tried to trace the call, but it was as if it came from nowhere. I decided to check the security footage from our building. The camera showed nothing unusual, just the empty corridors and the night staff at their posts. But then, in one frame, I saw it. There was a figure just at the edge of the camera's view, standing still in the shadows. It was there for a split second, then it was gone. My blood ran cold. I called security, but they found nothing. The night stretched on, each call more disturbing than the last. People reported their devices turning on by themselves, showing them live feeds of their own homes, and their families asleep and unaware. Each time, the calls would cut off, leaving me in a chilling silence. By 4 a.m., I was alone in the call center. My colleagues had either gone home or were too scared to stay. I sat there, the only sound the ticking of the clock. Then, my computer screen flickered, and a message appeared. I'm here. The room temperature dropped. I looked around, but I was still alone. Then the message changed. You should have left when you could. That's when I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the corridor. I grabbed my coat and ran, not stopping until I was outside, the cold air biting my face. I also never went back to that call center. The next day, the news reported a series of cyber attacks, but nothing about what I experienced. I left tech support after that, the fear of what might be watching from the other side of the screen too much to bear. Sometimes, I wonder if it was all in my head, but then I remember those calls, those eyes from the shadows, and I know it was real.